Hello. I would love to start with a quick story, and I'm not going to give you any creative exercises, so I apologize for that, but well done, Stefan. In 2021, my company, Sparkbox, partnered with a large financial institution, and they hired us because they were a little bit old school and they wanted to develop some new digital product ideas. So they brought us in to partner with their team to do two things. One, to help them build out an MVP, a minimum viable product for an idea that they had. And then the second, alongside that MVP, they asked us if we could help them build a design system. And the intent was, I believe, that over time they would be able to take this design system and use it to help build out future new ideas that they had. And they wanted to be able to work a little quickly with those new ideas and test them. So we were excited, 2021, we came alongside their team, we worked with them for that entire year. And I wish that I could stand here and show you all of this amazing work that we did and tell you how wonderful it was. But unfortunately, that project didn't go that well for us. It was a real struggle. And in fact, it was so difficult that at the end of that year, we had to make the really hard decision to walk away from that customer. Now, I know this isn't the normal story that you get at a conference talk, right? But the reason that we had to give to this customer for why we walked away was cultural incompatibility. And this just did not sit well with me. In 14 years of running my own studio, I had never had to do this before. And so it was the end of the year, we made this decision, this difficult choice, and I spent the entire holiday season sitting at my house, moping, sadly, and trying to figure out what had happened. And I decided that I was going to start to understand what I meant when I said cultural incompatibility. And so this experience for me at the end of 2021 led me down a path of research around understanding organizational culture that I would love to share a little bit of with you today, if that's all right. So in that research, I discovered two frameworks that I didn't develop, that were developed in the late 90s, that I think are really helpful and relevant. The first of those is just a concept for how to talk about culture, because culture can be a little bit difficult for us to discuss. It's kind of ambiguous, you know. And so I found this one framework by a gentleman named Edgar Sheen, who's a social scientist and a professor in the United States. And it offers a really simple model that we can use just to talk about culture. So let me show you what he said. He said culture is made up of three layers. He said the first is our basic underlying assumptions. The second, our espoused beliefs. And the third is the artifacts of the culture. Now, the artifacts are the things that you see. So you can observe these from inside the organization or from outside the organization. These are things like the foosball table or the free lunch that you get, right? All the stuff that's visible and available for you to see without even discussing with folks. The espoused beliefs are the things that people say. So the company mission, the vision, the values, that big slogan that's painted on the wall when you first walk into your office, perhaps the conversations you have in Slack or Teams or wherever you all have conversations. And the basic underlying assumptions are what people actually believe. And these are, believe it or not, much harder to determine. Usually, you only discover what these are in the midst of a very difficult decision. Now, as an employee, you experience these things from the top down. So on your first day at a new company, you observe what's happening around you. And eventually, you get to meet some of your coworkers, you make some friends, you have some conversations, and you get to hear the things that they say about the organization. And then, over time, the organization or your leaders, your peers will be faced with a difficult situation. And you'll get to understand what they actually believe when you get to see how they decide to behave in the midst of something very difficult. Now, when these three layers don't line up, we call that a weak culture. So when the things that people, when the things you see and what people say and what people believe don't line up, this is weak. And nobody wants to work in an organization like this. We feel a tension. Sometimes we don't quite know how to describe it, but these are cultures where oftentimes there's a lot of process in place to kind of police the behavior of individuals. When they do line up, we call it a strong culture, and this creates a lot of safety, right? We understand and we believe the same things. We have the same shared values. And this is the kind of place where you can have the safety, actually, that Stefan was describing, to speak with a bad idea, perhaps, or to have conversations that are challenging with each other. There's a lot of trust that can be built in these situations. Now, I know I haven't said a word yet about design systems. I promise you, we're going to get there. The second framework that I want to share with you was developed by Kim Cameron and Robert Quinn in the late 90s. And it's called the Competing Values Framework. And in this framework, there are 4 primary types of organizational culture. Now, they call it the Competing Values Framework because there are 2 sets of competing values. So let me show you kind of what these sets are. The y-axis of their model spans from flexible at the top down to focused at the bottom. Now, a flexible organization means one that is dynamic, one that is adaptive, one that's willing to change as things around them require that change. An organization that is focused is one that values stability. So these are organizations that believe in their founding principles as ideals that will get them through difficult times. Now, on the x-axis, they plot a different kind of value, internal versus external. And an internal orientation of an organization means that they make decisions based on things happening inside the organization, perhaps the concerns of their employees. And an external oriented organization is one that makes decisions based on things happening outside the organization. So things like the market or the industry they're in or their competitors, perhaps. Now, most organizations are going to have some of each of these characteristics, but this does give us a really nice lens through which we can talk about and observe our own organizational cultures. So let's take a very quick look at each of the quadrants. And as I go through these, I want you to imagine that you're having a conversation with your president or your CEO, your leadership. And I want you to just hear in your mind which of these quadrants most closely aligns with the organization that you work in, all right? So in the top left, we're joining flexibility with an internal orientation. This is a collaborative or clan culture. There's an eye toward long-term development here. Cohesion, morale, mutual support, and doing things together are valued. In the bottom left, we're joining focus with an internal orientation. So this is a control or hierarchy culture. And this is where progress tends to be slower and more incremental. There's a respect for hierarchy here. And the value is placed on stability and predictability and measurement. Here we want to do things right. Now, I'm going to pause just for a moment because when I was exploring some of this research, I remember getting to this point and thinking to myself, oh, collaboration is good, control is bad. But that's not at all the intent of the authors here. We have to use some words to describe these quadrants, so I want you to try your best to get rid of any preconceived ideas about collaboration or control, and just see these all as potentially good or potentially bad, depending on the health of the organization, all right? So there's no right or wrong answers. There can be healthy versions of every one of these and unhealthy versions of each, all right? So let's continue. In the top right, we're joining flexibility with an external orientation. So this is a creative or adhocracy culture. And this is where new ideas can really break through. A lot of flexibility here, creativity, disruption, entrepreneurship is rewarded in this quadrant. And there's a lot of value placed here on doing things first. And this is an organization where your startup or scale up tends to kind of fall in this quadrant. Now, I had to look up what the word adhocracy means. It's just the opposite of bureaucracy, so kind of anything goes in this quadrant. In the bottom right, this is where we're joining focus with an external orientation. And this is a competitive or market culture. There's an eye towards short-term performance here. The individuals are rewarded for doing things fast. So these are organizations that are oftentimes acquiring their competition to try and beat them. Now, I'm imagining that as I read through these, you can sort of quickly kind of place where your organization lives. So I'm going to also put up here 4 additional sentiments. And in my research, I've talked with hundreds of folks in lots of different organizations to try and understand the impacts of this on the work that we're doing with design systems. So these are the kinds of phrases that I've heard from the folks in each of these quadrants. And I'm going to read through these. And what I'd like to do is just see you raise your hand if you feel, if your president, your CEO was here, could you imagine them saying this phrase about the company, all right? So in the top left, collaborative, people first. How many of you think your bosses would say this? Okay, good. And how about in the bottom left, control? How many of you could hear your bosses talking about avoiding risk? Okay, lots of you over here. This is the avoiding risk corner. In the top right, creative. Okay, how many of you could hear your boss talking about disrupting the industry? Anybody? Not as many. Okay, there's a few. All right. Excellent. And then our last one, the competitive culture. How many of you could hear your boss talking about beating the competition? Okay, quite a few of those. All right. Interesting. Good. Now, what's cool about culture is that culture is formed any place a group of people get together consistently. So that means your organization has a culture, as we've just talked about, but that also means that the group of folks who get together over lunch to read a book together are forming their own subculture inside of the organization's culture. And that means your product teams have their own subcultures. And that means if you have a design system program, that program itself is developing its own subculture. So this is where things start to get really interesting. In my conversations with folks who are leading design system teams, I've asked them all the questions I need to understand these quadrants and their context, and almost every single one of them has identified that their subculture for their design system program exists on the left side of this diagram. And it makes sense if you think about it, because design systems tend to be internal tools, right? Things that we're designing and building to serve the product teams inside our organization. And so the internal orientation is a natural fit for those parts of the organization. So if we kind of use that as a basis, what that means is that most of the times, the subcultures of our design system programs are either collaborative or controlling. Now remember, neither of these are good or bad, all right? But in my conversations, I've heard lots of statements, and I've tried to kind of summarize these down. And so one common thing that I hear from design system leaders who are trying to build a subculture in that collaborative space, they'll say something like this: I believe the scope of my work cannot be accomplished in any way other than to partner with the teams who have also caught this vision. So that is a very collaborative mentality to come to the work with. And the opposite of this, sort of on that control side, in my conversations with folks leading those types of subcultures, I hear this sort of statement. They'll say, my product teams haven't created consistency, so I'm here to make sure that they do going forward. So this is an interesting contrast between these two approaches, very extreme approaches, to how to create and offer a collaborative or a controlling design system program. Now again, neither of these is right or wrong, but there are healthy and unhealthy versions of each. So in some survey work that I've been doing, I've been able to kind of draw some correlations to some interesting characteristics around these two types of design systems programs. So let's take these and move them horizontally here. And what's important to walk away with is to recognize these are ends of a spectrum, okay? So there's space between. But there are also a healthy range here, and there's also an unhealthy range if we push to the very extreme sides of these. So let me give you just a couple examples. If we were to lay in here the concept of prioritization, so in my design system work, how do I prioritize what features, what functions to work on next in my system? That process of determining. Then we can look at this and we can wonder, what does a healthy collaborative prioritization exercise look like? It turns out organizations that are focused in this collaborative space, they make prioritized decisions based primarily on the subscriber's needs. And when I say subscriber, I mean the users of the design system, so the people on the product teams that are using that system. So they're understanding the needs of those folks and prioritizing based on their needs. A healthy version of the control tends to make those prioritization decisions based on the needs of the organization. It's a little bit more top-down, right? Now, if we push these into the unhealthy regions, what you'll find, an unhealthy collaborative approach is where we're trying to prioritize everybody's needs. And of course, if you've done this, you know that you're going to serve nobody well by doing that, right? And the opposite is true here. On the unhealthy control side, this is where we're just simply ignoring input from our users or subscribers. And again, we're not going to serve anybody well here. So these extreme ends are where we start to see these unhealthy behaviors. Now, if we take another example, let's talk about adoption. And when I say adoption, I simply mean, how are we driving folks to use the system? What do we do to encourage its use? And so a healthy collaborative approach, adoption is driven by relationship. We get to know those folks on those product teams. We spend time with them. We understand their needs. We actually come alongside them and help them become a user of the system. A healthy controlling approach is driven primarily by incentive. In other words, this is where we're talking perhaps to the bosses and saying, hey, let's add the idea of using the design system as a key part in what determines whether individuals are successful or not. So it becomes a metric for gauging the success of teams. Now, if we push this out to these unhealthy extreme ends, the unhealthy collaborative approach, it's an unsustainable over-support through the adoption process. So this is a little bit weird, but what I'm trying to suggest is that the teams that are unhealthy in this space, they're actually doing the work for the subscribers, for the users. They're actually over-supporting them. And what we don't realize when we do this, because sometimes we're so desperate to get these folks using our systems, is that we're actually training them how to behave with us, right? Every interaction we have with those teams is demonstrating what we expect that relationship to be like. It's not sustainable long-term for you to do everything for them. So you have to teach them to fish, right, instead of giving them the fish. And on the other side, an unhealthy control, it's an unsustainable non-support. In other words, we write a few documentations and we say, go figure it out yourself. And that, of course, is not sustainable either. Now, I'll give you just one more quick example with the concept of extension. And in design systems, when we say extension, what we're doing is recognizing that the system itself is never going to meet everybody's needs perfectly. And so in those moments where a product team is using the system and it doesn't do what they need, oftentimes they're tempted to either take it and extend it in some way or to just leave it alone and go find another way. So there are healthy and unhealthy versions or approaches to this. In the collaborative culture, I call this intentional flexibility. So extension of the system is encouraged. And in these models, these teams have actually taken the time to think through how is it that we allow extension. Right? We recognize the system's never going to meet all of their needs, so let's create a path for them to follow that allows them to understand how to extend in a healthy way. On the control side, I call it necessarily restrictive. And a lot of times here, these systems oftentimes are born out of a need for consistency. And so in this healthy control approach, they discourage the extension of the system. Now, you can imagine what the two unhealthy ends are here, right? Extreme flexibility for collaboration. This is where the extension of the system is overused. Almost every product is just extending everything. And over time, that just simply leads to you not having a design system at all, right? It's not a systematic way to work. And on the unhealthy control, we have extreme restriction. And this is where extension of the system is simply forbidden. So it's just not permitted. And this is so rigid that oftentimes when I speak with folks, they tell me that their teams just stop using the system because they actually can't get their work done. Okay, so what I want you to take away from this is that there's a lot of nuance in the way that we choose to work, okay? And this competing values framework is useful because it gives us a good overview of the kinds of organizational cultures that we can expect. And we recognize that, again, most of our design system programs fall on the left side. But what's really interesting about this is the way that these cultures interact with each other. So the way that works is that cultures which are diagonally opposed are incompatible. They're like oil and water. Let me give you just a couple examples. If your organization happens to be in this creative, entrepreneurial, do things first sort of space, so top right, then you are going to have a really hard time trying to build a design system program that is going to succeed as a controlling, do things right type of culture. And think about this, right? In the top right, this is where we're disrupting everything. We're breaking the rules. In the bottom left, this is where we're saying, no, we know the right way to do a thing, so we're going to follow the way that we know. Those two concepts are just completely incompatible, right? So if you're trying to operate in a controlling way as a subculture inside an organization that is creative, it's going to be like you're swimming against the current of a river. I actually had one interview that really stood out with me. I was talking with a young lady who had led the design system inside of a startup, a big kind of, you probably would know this company, but a big startup, web-based product. And their product was kind of all over the place. The interface was very inconsistent. And so they hired this woman to come in and, for the product teams, build a design system. And I think in their minds, they thought, our product is wildly inconsistent. Let's build a system, and then we'll force the product teams to use it, and everything will be consistent. And so that's what she did. And the system that she built, with that as her mandate, was very restrictive. It was very limiting. And what happened is all of those product teams just would not use it. And the reason they wouldn't, they found out over time, is that the organization still hadn't found their place in the market. So they were pivoting constantly, changing the direction of this product. And that was necessary for the business. And so what this wonderful little statement that she gave me towards the end, she said, we should have recognized the need for flexibility in the system as a way of supporting the necessary pivots that our company was taking to find our place in the market. That would have built trust with our subscribers as an enabling tool instead of a restricting one. Now, that story that she told me, without even knowing it, was basically her acknowledging that she should have tried this instead, right? Had she operated in a more collaborative way, that would have enabled the flexibility they needed in their culture. These two cultures are very compatible, okay? So now the opposite is also true. So if you find that your organization as a whole is in this competitive, do things fast quadrant, it's actually really hard for your design system program to succeed if you're trying to do that as a collaborative, do things together kind of culture. In fact, if you think back to that story that I started with about the organization that we were working alongside and we chose to walk away from them, when I kind of came to the end of this research, one of the things I realized is this actually is kind of what we were trying to do. And that's because my company, Sparkbox, is a wildly collaborative place. That's because it's built by me, and I'm a collaborative guy. So I've put a lot of myself into our culture. And so we operate in that top left quadrant regularly. What we hadn't done was we didn't do the work to understand the culture of the organization we were trying to partner with. And so we were trying desperately to get them to work collaboratively with us. In fact, probably what we should have done was something like this. Taken a bit more of a controlling approach, a bit more of a hierarchical approach, and that would have allowed us to serve their needs a little bit better. So the big takeaway for me in all of this is that I have to take time to kind of look up from the work, to look around and understand that there are these kinds of cultural forces at play. You can try to pretend that they don't exist, but the truth is that they do. They're always operating, they're always there. And so you have to recognize that. I would say that it's very important for us now, and this has changed the way that we approach our work. We do a lot now to understand the cultures of the organizations we want to work with so that we can serve them better. Now, I'm continuing my research in this space, so I've created a little culture survey. Now, I want to tell you that this survey takes a lot of time. I'm sure you're used to taking 5 or 10-minute surveys. This will take you at least 30 minutes, okay? So it's a lot of work. But I'll also say this, if you're willing to do this for me, because I'm still trying to gather this information, if you're willing to do this, I'll also give you 30 minutes to explain your specific results to you, okay? So I know it's a lot to ask, so I'm trying to kind of meet you halfway. If you're willing to do this, I'll sit down with you, we'll do a quick call just to sort of walk you through the things that you're learning. This will help you to understand where your organization's culture is and where the subculture of your design system program is. And then we can draw some other interesting inferences from that as well. Now, anytime that I talk about this kind of thing, I get this question. Can the design system subculture change the culture of the organization? And I have seen this happen, but it's a long process. And it actually kind of comes back to this diagram. So you'll recall that as employees, we experience this from the top down. But that's actually not how culture is created. You've probably been in an organization where these things don't align and they try to fix it by buying you lunch, right? That doesn't fix it, right? So culture is actually created from the bottom up. And we do that by identifying the underlying assumptions that are shared around the individuals. And those become our common values. And when you can find unity in those underlying assumptions, then the other two layers really just become a natural outpouring of those beliefs. With this cultural alignment, the things we say and the things we see are simply a reflection of the things that we believe. I can give you 3 simple things that you can start to work on to curate your own culture. The first of those is to model it. This starts with you as a leader, as an individual. You have to behave in a way that you expect the others to also behave. The second is to meet folks where they are. You need to understand where people are having conversations, how they learn, and you have to go to those places and interact with them in those places. And the third is that you have to be consistent. This takes years sometimes to enable this kind of cultural curation. Now, I'll end with just one statement for you, and that is that your design system will not make your products more consistent. Think about it. You and I could take any design system that exists, no matter how restrictive, and we could create wildly inconsistent products with it, right? And that is because people will make what they want to make. And the critical word here is the word want. So if consistency or cohesion is your goal, the only sustainable way to get that is to change what your users, your subscribers want to do. And you do this with culture. You don't do this with pixels or code, not with Figma, not with React or Angular. And your system can be a catalyst for this kind of change, but it will not do this on its own. This is the unspoken and deeply challenging mandate of design system work. This is your job. I sincerely hope some of these ideas will help you to do that job a little bit better tomorrow. Thank you so much.